Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for coming along here. And when Gosha sent out the schedule and there was a free place here at the very first slot of the term, I thought I'll give myself an opportunity to summarize this work here, because I was asked to give a keynote talk this summer at a conference in Hawaii. So I got this amazing trip to Hawaii, where I presented this in a session on active volcanism and society. And I thought I'll share this a little bit with the group here. So, but then, when I came back, I thought I have a little summer holiday, but it didn't quite work out this way, because as soon as I was back, the Iceland eruption started again. And so I spent actually a few weeks on Iceland now, and that means my summer holiday will have to be postponed into the autumn. But anyway, so a lot of active volcanism right now, but there is volcanic activity at some volcanoes that are actually a lot more persistent. And Merapi is one of those volcanoes where we have much longer activity. It's a bit like Etna. It's not in the news anymore because it's such a persistent activity. And Merapi is also in an area which is very densely populated, and this causes a lot of issues, but of course then also opportunities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Merapi first, and it's one of the most active volcanoes in Indonesia and actually in the world. And there is close to 2 million people living in the direct vicinity. It's very high on the population vulnerability index, therefore, and it's characterized by these long periods of dome growth. They happen over tens of years, and then it has these very short explosive events. And we have been thinking about how this works, what is the causes for this, and how to protect the population there, of course. The population density is super high. We are reaching, even on the slopes of the volcano, several hundred people per square kilometer. And we should point out Sweden has a population density of 22 or 24 people per square kilometer. So it's a fundamentally different situation in terms of people interacting with the natural environment. So in 2006, there was a major eruption and 6,000 people got killed in an earthquake that happened during the eruption. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. And in 2010 was another big eruption and 350 people were killed then. Prediction of these events is extremely difficult, and these explosive events, they build up in a very short time, and then we have these associated earthquakes. They come almost out of nowhere, and this makes the situation there very difficult and very dangerous. So this is Merapi volcano. This is the top of Merapi volcano. You can't climb into the crater. It's not a possibility. So there is actually dead bodies lying in there. It's a bit like Mount Everest. People were trying to go into the crater and didn't come back, and that kind of thing. So, and there is a new dome that has been growing inside this crater, which started to appear in 2018. And this new dome is cooking the surrounding rock, making it very unstable. And we had a paper earlier this year, Damavan et al., about the cooking of the dome and how the instability will then cause more rock falls and pyroclastic flows and things like that. So this is a persistent activity since 2018. The dome is growing gradually. It's a bit like toothpaste oozing out of the vent, and at times it collapses, and these times are variable. Sometimes it's because of internal pressures, sometimes it's because of external things like earthquakes, and this is a very dynamic situation therefore. In 2006, I mentioned there was a rather really intense catastrophe. A major collapse of the upper part of the volcano led to this village here, Kaliatem, being entirely wiped out. Luckily, most people were evacuated at the time, and we were investigating the situation. And as you see, I mean, this is a zone of devastation, really. And in the duration of this eruption, there was a major earthquake happening, and that affected an even wider region. And here is some of the important buildings. This is the upper one is a ministry building. The lower one is a university building, actually. And these buildings were utterly destroyed, and there was several thousand people dying at the time in these events, 2006. So there was emergency shelters. There was close to 1 million people homeless at the time for various durations, and a lot of international aid came in. and people had to kind of make do with rather difficult situations for quite some time. And this is from a humanitarian aspect, this is very serious and requires a lot of extra thinking, I believe. So the complicated issue, however, is that people are not always readily responding to authority warnings, and there is a very rich cultural tradition with multiple religions. Islam is the dominant religion, but there is also a Buddhist and a Hindu tradition, and different villages, different regions have slightly different traditions, and some people or regions or communities are more likely to follow authority warnings than others, and some communities actively resist the authority warnings. So many worry also about financial consequences if you're evacuated, and they rely on local wisdom, ancient legends, and things like that, that believes that there's a mythical relationship with the volcano and with the natural environment. And this led to a rather complicated situation in 2010, where the spiritual guardian of the volcano recommended that people stay, but then he and many in his village actually died in a pyroclastic eruption. So this shows the complication there. And the local traditions, they are quite rich, and there is a few elements I'd like to highlight now, and that is that there is a belief that there's a spiritual world underlying many of these natural forces, and there is a spiritual kingdom inside the volcano, but also at the southern end of Java, opposing the volcano, there is another mystical power that plays a role, and the local people perform all sorts of rituals, and they bring offerings to the volcano, but also to other places around the area, in the hope that these natural forces will not be so devastating. So food offerings, flowers, fabric, etc. are very common, and the Sultan's palace is right in between some of these, and let me show that here. So this is Java Island, which is one of the most densely populated islands in the world, and Merapi volcano is here. There's an older volcano, Merapi, just to the north, and there's Parangtritis Beach, which is another fabled area of a mystical power. I'll come back to that a little later. And there's the city of Yogyakarta, and the Sultan's palace is right in the middle of the city. And the earthquakes, they happen all the way in between Merapi and Parangtritis. And geologically, there is a reason for this being also a spiritual realm in the local legends, and that is the fault lines actually run into the Asian Sea down there. So there's a geological reason for this being a dynamic and active area. So the axis that I just described is very well described in local legends, and it goes back hundreds of years. And I call it the Merapi South-D axis, the MKSS axis. And it's been described by various workers. And the left image here is a painting that we annotated that is actually in the Sultan's palace in Yogyakarta. And then in the middle, this is my version or our version of this kind of axis. And you see Merapi being there in the north, and the South Sea in the southern end of this axis, and the Kraton, which is the palace of the Sultan with the public square and the mosque, etc., being placed inside there. And these volcanoes, Merapi and Merapi, they're often called twin volcanoes. They have been depicted in many of these local batiks, which I show in the top right, and there's modern forms of batik, and this is the image in the lower right here. And these are very dominant geographical features in the region. And this axis is still present, or still plays a role today. And there's not just palaces on this axis, there's also modern monuments built on this axis. The monument to the Independence War in the top left of the photo section there is also placed on this axis. So still a lot of buildings are put on this. This axis is also the main traffic line in the area, and it still plays a major role in the mind of the people and in the mind of the society there. So, and this goes back for hundreds of years. In fact, some of the most important cultural settings in this part of the world are placed on this axis. There's Borobudur, which is the largest Buddhist temple in all of Southeast Asia, and there's Prambanan, which is a Hindu temple, and they also linked to this axis. And the story goes that both of them were abandoned around about the year 1000, and it's not entirely clear why, but we're working on this actually. But it's said that major eruptions of the volcano have caused this. I believe that it wasn't just eruptions, it was probably also earthquakes, and also a lot of deposition from the volcano came down at that time. And there's a whole range of smaller temples that have been unearthed in the last 20 years in the Yogyakarta area. Here's Sambisari Temple. It's one of the really nice ones that was entirely covered by lahar deposits, by ash deposits, by volcanic material, and it was found several meters underground. A farmer found the first rocks and then they dug it out. And most recently, a little temple was found just when the new university building was erected, the library of the university. They found this little temple here, and this is part of the Shiva cult. And so this is a Hindu temple. And yeah, there was a lot of rich cultural life in the area, but it partly got buried and people had to move away. So now let me talk a little bit more about the volcano and the spiritual part of the volcano. The belief is that Java, initially when the gods created it, it was a bit out of power. It was a bit out of balance, sorry. And the gods wanted to balance it. So they would try to shift around volcanoes. But there was two brothers living in central Java, and they were blacksmiths, and they had a forge there. And these two blacksmith brothers, they refused to leave when the gods wanted to put a volcano there. And so the gods eventually put the volcano on top of these two brothers, and the brothers were called Rama and Parmadi, and they are now inside the volcano. So it's very similar to the beliefs in the Mediterranean, that there's a blacksmith on the Etna, for example. And Rama and Parmadi, they gave then name to the volcano, and they have a forge in there, and they are the kings of this spiritual realm inside the volcano. So these two have then built up this kingdom inside the volcano, and the kingdom has workers and servants and even spiritual pets. And if the kingdom needs more people, then people on the volcano actually die. If hikers disappear, for example, then it's believed that they were integrated into that kingdom inside the volcano. So there is this spiritual world inside the volcano, and a lot of local people believe that they have a connection to this spiritual world. The opposite end of this geographical area is the Parangtritis beach, the South Sea area. And this is where another mythical realm exists, and this is where Ratu Kidul, the queen of the South Sea, lives. And her color is green. You're not allowed to wear green on that beach, otherwise she will come and get you. And she is the ruler of waves and oceans and water. So she resides in Parangtritis, and her color is green, as I said. She rules over the waters, and she has the power to claim lives. And offerings are made to her as well every year. And she has a link to the rulers of Yogyakarta and to Merapi volcano. So, and the story goes, I'll keep it rather short here. The details are for those people who are interested. But one of the previous sultans, he went to offer there, and he was then having a pact with this queen of the South Sea. And she taught him many things. And this is how this connection comes about. And she's therefore a protective spirit for the Sultanate of Yogyakarta. And this goes on to today. These three kingdoms, as it's often kind of called, the South Sea, Jogja and Merapi, they are connected. And the queen of the South Sea, she often travels on the rivers to visit either the Sultan or Merapi. And it's said when she travels that the ground is shaking and the ground is rumbling. And if you ask me, this is actually symptomatic of earthquakes rather than anything else. So, and there is this connection between the volcano and the earthquakes in these ancient legends. And this brings me on to a bit of earth science now, a bit of modern perspective in the sense of modern earth sciences. And there was this major eruption in 2006, and it commenced in mid-March. And then after about 6 weeks, there was this major earthquake. And after the earthquake happened, the volcano got intense in terms of the eruption intensity. That's the diagram here on the right. and there was more material coming down from the volcano. The earthquake was along one of the rivers, along of the faults that mark the rivers in the area. And the increase is therefore, or was linked by the local people to these ancient legends. It was linked to Ratu Kidul, the queen of the South Sea, traveling on the rivers and visiting the volcano. And I can see how these things came together in these legends. So there is this fault system south of the volcano, and it's very active, and you can see it in the landscape. And this was the earthquake that also killed the large number of people in 2006. So it's some 25 to 30 kilometers away from the volcano, but I'll talk a little bit later. Can this connect to the volcano in any reasonable way in our understanding? And I think one prospect that's been reasonably very fashionable is that fluids can migrate. We know this from Italian research. Fluids or gases can actually travel through fractures, and they could potentially lubricate these. So this has been discussed for the Aquila earthquake, for example, and I think it might apply to our situation here as well. So why would Merapi have loads of fluids as opposed to other volcanoes? Well, there's something special about Merapi, and that is it sits on limestone. And we all know if you put acid on limestone, it starts to fizz. Limestone actually has 42% of CO2 in its structure. And if you have carbonate limestone and you add silica, i.e. magma, it will start to convert to wollastonite, which is a mineral, and it will release a lot of CO2. And there's a picture of a limestone quarry in the top right, and we find these wollastonite-rich xenolith foreign rocks in the lavas, and this is the two other pictures here. And this area under the volcano is some 10 kilometers thick, so the magma has to go through some 10 kilometers of limestone to get to the surface. Plenty of possibility for liberating a lot of CO2. So, and if we want to accept this, then we can do some model calculations here, and I'll spare you the details, but the thing is that if you put a cube of 80 meters into a magma reservoir under the volcano, you can make 60,000 tons of CO2 in a day, and you can assimilate this potentially over a week. So huge amounts of CO2 could be produced. And of course, one question is then, how quickly can you do that? How effective or efficient is that process? And here we come back to some work by Francis. This was starting off in a PhD and continued afterwards. We did some experiments where we cooked up magma with some limestone fragments in it. And the reality is that this reaction takes only minutes. And just to fill you in, on the left here, we have an experimental image of a limestone fragment in artificial magma of the right composition. And after we heat this up to magmatic temperature, the limestone is gone. And there's loads of CO2 bubbles in the experiment. The heating up time is literally minutes. So to digest this limestone and to make CO2 gas will take a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes only. So, and is this a reality? Well, I set out to test this, and this was when I was a little younger and more adventurous. I went up the volcano in 2006 at the end of the eruption, and I sampled gas. And here's a timeline from 1990s to 2010 for gas samples from the volcano. And the big spike in 2006, that's the sample I took that summer. And it is displaced from the regular baseline of the volcano towards marine carbonate chemistry in the carbon isotopes. And we have a very good indication here that there is indeed limestone gas or limestone-derived CO2 in the system. And I have a few reference data for Krakatau, which does not sit on limestone, and you see the values are completely different. They're more mantle-like, while Merapi is generally already elevated, but during eruption, it seems to break the limestone basement and release even more CO2. So I think the big question here is, did ancient legends capture this? And the large volume of CO2 that could potentially be released is certainly an indication. And it would imply that the more active the volcano, the more CO2 we release. And in ancient times, when the volcano was particularly active, we have this cycle study that tells us that the volcano was particularly active round about the year 1000. and this is also when several of these cultures collapsed, then I think there is something to this. People were capturing this problem, this interaction between the basement, between the faults and the volcano in these ancient legends. And modern calculations allow us to show that the fluids can actually travel in a reasonable time to these faults where these earthquakes occur. So local folklore, I argue, and we argue, is able to capture these very complicated dynamic geological situations that we only start to understand today. And if this is something to go by, we must accept that these processes, volcano-earthquake interaction, happened very frequently in the past as well, particularly in heightened activity periods. And if we go to some of these temples, we do see these wollastonite-rich fragments in the rocks. And here's an ancient image or a vintage image from the Borobudur temple. And there you see that tilt in the rocks and the building stones. That's an ancient earthquake frozen in. So these earthquakes did occur in the past, I believe. So whether you want to believe in the details of this kind of interpretation or not is up to you. But there's something very important, and I'd like to close with this aspect, and that is that in 2018 at Mojo and co-workers have started a pilot project. They have used these interpretations of the ancient legends that we published in 2015 and have made them part of primary school teaching in a number of test schools on the slopes of the volcano. The test schools were compared to control schools where no such teaching was happening, and the exam results were consistently better for these kind of aspects, for hazard awareness and understanding of natural hazards in those test schools, between 10 and 22%. And all of the test schools had more than 70% of the students attaining a high level of knowledge gain, while the control schools did not. So these ancient legends, therefore, they offer a rather intriguing but very powerful way of reaching people, of communicating hazards to people. And it's amazing, to me at least, that these ancient legends, they were designed to warn people. They are effectively hazard catalogues, but without the geological knowledge. And I believe they have done a great job in the past, and they still doing a great job today. They still warn people about things, and hopefully some more people in the future will respond to evacuation warnings, having this knowledge now. And once these children will grow up, hopefully they will respond in the right way with their communities, and hopefully this will actually save lives in the future. So I'd like to close here and say thank you for your time, and I'd like to point out that we have this summer submitted a major book to Springer Nature now. And this is a book edited by several others and myself, together with Indonesian colleagues, on Merapi volcano. It's got 18 chapters. It's looking at the history, at the research, at the current situation, at hazard prevention. We have a review from the USGS that has just come in on the book, and they called it monumental. So I hope it's going to really make a difference now in the future when it comes to the situation at Merapi, and hopefully the death toll in the future will go down, and we can hopefully make a real difference at that volcano. So thank you very much, and I close here, and hopefully there's a few questions.